What's the best deadlift variation for growing your glutes? Let's talk about it.
Don't you want to look good naked?
So we're talking about different variations of deadlifts for glute growth. The biggest thing that we want to pay attention to is the word growth. So that means that our goal is to build muscle, right? And so when we're talking about building muscle, we need to make sure that we're creating as much tension in the specific muscle tissue as possible. So when we're talking about deadlifts for glutes, I think the biggest thing is to think about constant tension deadlifts. So whether you're doing a Romania deadlift, or maybe you're doing a constant tension trap bar deadlift, that's one of my favorite, also referred to as a floating trap bar deadlift. There's different names for that. But really just thinking about getting your muscles to create as much tension as possible throughout the full range of motion. And so with a traditional conventional deadlift where you're starting from the floor and you're picking the weight up and then you're coming back down and dropping on the floor and then picking it back up again, each rep, you're gonna be losing tension each time, right? So you're literally releasing all of the tension on the floor and then you're picking it back up. Probably not gonna be the best if the main goal is to build as much muscle in your glutes as possible, right? We wanna create tension. So I love the RDLs. RDLs are great for creating tension in your glutes. And there's some slight variations that you can make when you're performing your RDLs to actually bias your glutes a little bit more than your hamstrings. So for example, we know with RDLs, the main muscles that are gonna be working with that are your glutes and your hamstrings. However, if you want to kind of disadvantage your hamstrings a little bit, not necessarily like completely cut them out of the movement, but just disadvantage them a little bit so that you can bias more of your glutes. One trick you can do is actually bend your knees a little bit more. So when you're performing that RDL, if you have a little bit more of a slight bend in your knee, typically around like 15 degrees, you don't have to go get your protractor out and measure it, but just a slight bend in your knees, that will actually advantage your glutes a little bit more and take away a little bit of your hamstrings or disadvantage your hamstrings a little bit. And if you wanted to do the opposite, you could just have more of a straight leg. I really like bent knee RDL versions. So those are gonna be like bent knee trap bar LDL, bent knee trap bar RDLs, barbell bent knee RDLs, dumbbells, you can use cables. There's a bunch of different variations you can do. The other thing to think about with RDLs is your hip hinge. So that's a big part of it as well. So I talked about bending your knee a little bit to bias the glutes, but you also wanna make sure no matter what, with your RDLs that you're focusing on the hip hinge. And that is really just pushing your butt back until it can't go back anymore. And so with this, we wanna think of two things. The first thing is you wanna stay in your active range of motion. And all that means is that when you're doing a hip hinge type movement where you're pushing your butt back as much as possible, you actually don't wanna think about, coming as far down to the floor as you can. That's not the goal. The goal of a hip hinge movement, especially to put your glutes under the most tension as possible, is to stop where your active range stops. So a great way that I like to think about this is when you come back from the grocery store and you're coming out of your car or wherever it may be, and you have your hands full of groceries or bags and you need to close the car door. How do you do that? I know that I just use my butt because that's all that's available. Doing that, if you think about that motion, like your hands are full and you're trying to close your car door, you basically just pop your butt back, and that's a hinge, right? So that's the hinge movement. So with an RDL, when we're focused on glutes specifically, we wanna make sure that we're doing that hinge versus just bending our knees. If I'm trying to train my glutes with as much tension as possible and get that hip hinge movement, I wanna keep it in my glutes as much as possible and not let my spine round as I'm coming down or go out of my active range where my back muscles start to take over. So our lower back muscles, our erectors is what they call them. If you're going outside of your active range of motion, it's going to cause the tension to shift from your glutes and your hamstrings to your lower back. And so unless you want to be training your lower back or your erectors, which some people do, it's good to have strong erector muscles, again, lower back muscles. But some people kind of say like, oh, I felt that in my lower back. I don't like to do RDLs because I feel it in my lower back. Typically, it's because you're going outside of your range of motion, which just means you're going a little bit too low. Another thing that you want to think about when you're performing RDLs is to keep a neutral spine. And that's super important, specifically if you're trying to, again, create as much tension in your glutes as possible, is that you want to make sure that your entire spine, neck, and head are in alignment as you're coming down and coming up. So you don't want to look up. I like to think chin tucked a little bit as I'm coming down and keeping my head, neck, and spine in as much alignment as possible throughout the entire motion. And one main reason for that is just overall, you want to make sure that you have as much stability as possible, especially if you're lifting heavier weights. You can actually take away some tension from your glutes as well. So having a neutral spine is really important for not just safety reasons, but also to get as much out of the movement as possible. One other thing with deadlifts to build glutes is that you want to think about limiting factors. So grip strength can be something that's controversial because on one hand, a lot of people say you need to train your grip so that it's strong, right? That's a measure of longevity, especially as you're getting older. Grip strength is really important. However, if you're trying to build your glutes to the maximum ability possible, you want to make sure that your glutes are the limiting factor in whatever movement you're doing, right? And when I say limiting factor, it means that your glutes are the thing that fails first. If your grip is giving out before your glutes, that means that your grip is what's failing and you probably have a little bit more left in your glutes throughout the rest of that set. So what I like to think about is, okay, again, what's the primary goal? Is my primary goal to build my grip strength, or is my primary goal to build my butt? So for me, it's to build my butt. I have pretty good grip strength, and I know that I'm still gonna be getting, especially if I'm lifting heavier weights, right? Or lifting heavy weights, I'm still gonna be getting some grip strength, even if I'm using what we call wrist straps or grips. Versa grips are great. You're still gonna be using your grip. It's not like it just completely goes out the window, but we wanna make sure that that's not the limiting factor. So I like to use Versa grips whenever I'm doing any type of deadlift motion, especially when the weight starts to get heavier, or if I'm doing pulling motions or rowing motions when the weight starts to get heavier. They're great because they can basically make the muscle that you're targeting the limiting factor versus your grip. Another variation of a deadlift that's gonna be really great for teaching you that hip hinge movement is gonna be a hip banded RDL. So this is where you're gonna place a band either around a squat rack or somewhere stable, and you're going to have it just below your hip crease. And what it's gonna do is basically reinforce that hip hinge movement, and it's also going to create some tension at the top of the movement. So with traditional RDLs, deadlifts, floating deadlifts, the most tension is going to be at the bottom. That's where it's going to be the hardest, right? So within that lengthened position is what we call it, or we also call them stretchers. So those RDL movements are what I like to call the stretchy movements. So you're stretching your glutes, you're stretching your hamstrings, and creating as much tension as possible, but it's coming at the bottom position. So when you come up from an RDL, you might see some people do this little like hip thrusty thingy at the top of the movement while you're holding the weight to try to shorten the glutes or squeeze the glutes. The issue with that is that when you have that weight in your hands and your joints are completely stacked, which just means you're standing straight up and you're holding the weight, there's no tension whatsoever on your glutes. You could pretty much stand there for as long as possible, and what's gonna be the limiting factor is not your glutes, but your grip's gonna give out, your shoulders are gonna start to hurt, but you're really not gonna feel much in your glutes. And so the reason that adding a band can be helpful, or a great way to train your glutes in a more shortened or contracted position within that RDL movement, is because you can actually create tension at the top by pushing into that band a little bit. So that's a variation to add if you want to basically get as much out of that movement as possible, and also to basically reinforce that hip hinging movement as well. In terms of making it one of the best exercises for training your glutes in that shortened or contracted position, typically I like to go more so with a hip thrust or a glute bridge, where I can really create a lot of tension in that top position or in that contracted squeeze position with load with weight, right? So if you're thinking a hip thrust or a glute bridge where you have the weight across your hips and you're, getting into that shortened position, versus with an RDL, when you do put that band around your hips, yes, you can create more tension at the top with that band, but that band can only get so heavy. And so it's hard to load it up and it's hard to create more and more tension and progress that, in my opinion. So overall, if you want to incorporate deadlift variations to build your glutes, you just want to make sure that you're focusing on constant tension deadlifts or RDLs. So my favorites would be bent knee RDLs, so whether that's with a trap bar or a barbell or a dumbbell, so you're having a slight bend in your knee just to bias the glutes a little bit more. Any version of a constant tension deadlift, so if that's a floating trap bar deadlift where you're elevating yourself a little bit, when you come to the bottom, you're pausing a little bit, but you're not letting the weight hit the floor, so you're continuing to create as much tension as possible there. You can do hip banded barbell or hip banded dumbbell RDLs to, again, reinforce that hip hinge, but to also create tension at the top versus just kind of thrusting at the top and feeling like you're doing something, which again, when your joints are stacked at the top of the movement, it's not gonna be creating a lot of tension in your glutes. So those are some things that you can think about if your main goal is to use deadlifts to build your butt.
Women, we believe